When I was studying in England, I often hear a pretty consistent response when people learn that I'm from Singapore. How hot it must be there, and how cool and high-tech our buildings are. As a thinker and tinkerer in the built environment space, these remarks do warm the cockles of my urbanist heart. But there's just a little more than meets the eye. Perhaps not unlike a computer, cities are made of both hardware, buildings, streets, parks, electronic toll gantries, as well as software, everything else, relationships, cultures, communities, networks, systems. These interact with one another in various intricate ways. Racial and religious harmony is baked into our pledge. National holidays are scheduled based on the religious observances of major religious groups, and there are laws preventing the denigration of other religions. Social fault lines nevertheless persist, not just on ethnic and religious boundaries, but also ones on disability and class. A 2018 study by the Institute of Policy Studies found that, quote, "We are likely to mix with people of other races and age groups than those of different social standing," end quote. The corollary, or indeed a symptom, of a class divide is an unequal distribution of social capital. A 2017 study by the same institute also found that, quote, "Respondents were not likely to have named diverse networks across two particular types of social backgrounds, educational status and the type of housing that people live in," end quote. The researchers also wrote off, quote, "a self-reinforcing loop that requires active social programs and social development policies to break," end quote. Certainly, there appears to be a transition towards more transdisciplinary ways of thinking and doing, approaches which seem to be emerging in the healthcare, education, and technology sectors, for example. Crucially, as with paradigm shifts, this necessitates certain evolutions in our value systems. A sardonically aphoristic observational joke from the 90s delineated the 5 C's of Singapore: cash, car, credit card, condominium, and country club. A jab at materialism. Thus, this shift entails progressing from these desires and other correlated C's such as capital praise and co-opting towards way more versatile C's, say care, courage, curiosity, circularity, criticality, creativity, and compassion. Amidst the idiosyncrasies of Singaporean society are several movements and communities operating and agitating in these ways. One such group is Post-Growth Singapore.
Post-Growth Singapore is a group exploring post-growth principles and ideals in the context of Singapore, looking at how we can shift away from a growth-based economy and society into one that centers upon care and sufficiency while still being able to achieve high levels of human well-being. Since the start of this year, we have organized 2 film screenings to introduce post-growth concepts in Singapore. We have also dug deeper with a series of weekly circles to bring together people from different backgrounds and draw from their experiences and knowledge to imagine and perhaps operationalize a post-growth future in Singapore.
There's a certain reason why in nature things stop for after a while, right? But the way we approach economics today is that we seem to be able to pursue economic growth endlessly. Right? So if we want to avoid having our economy grow bigger than what our planetary systems and our social systems can support, we really start to need to look beyond economic growth to provide forms of societal well-being. But we're also concerned with the social cost of growth, which many of us Singaporeans are probably very familiar with. We are the most fertile country in the world. We even surpassing countries like China and Japan. I mean, burnout, hustle culture, sleep deficiency, loneliness are a lot of these social costs are also associated with this constant, ceaseless strive towards higher productivity, higher growth all the time.
I once walked into a greengrocer in England and discovered that the punnet of tomatoes in my hand was grown only 3.5 miles away at a farm I later visited. This was all really refreshing for me, as virtually all the food I saw growing up in 21st century Singapore came from a land far, far away. As such, my only contact with food was in its ready-to-cook or ready-to-eat, post-processed, often pre-packaged form. I never really thought about where my food comes from. It wasn't until I found myself just a few years ago holding a bag of kinky kale in a supermarket, grown by local urban farm Sustainea, that I began to ponder sustainable agriculture on home soil, and those buttressing that. These include the team of volunteers behind Goodman Community Farm, a permaculture food garden where I spent one slightly drizzly afternoon harvesting some basil and sweet potato leaves, while myself being feasted on by mosquitoes.
These permaculture communities or these farming communities, they have all these other non-monetary benefits that are not accounted for when you measure or pursue economic growth. Things like community cohesion, nature education, resilience, ecological services, the list goes on.
It certainly is encouraging to bear witness to the planting and watering of both the literal and proverbial seeds of flourishment, not least because of the agency it could afford us to make the future we want. Issues of accessibility are often discussed in architecture spaces, but disability justice is much more than ramps and tactile paving, even if that was the way I initially approached it at school, which led to a few helter-skelter-like buildings in my early design portfolio. The work of Joss Boyce and Matrix, which I encountered at a school talk, was my primer into design justice and design activism. It highlighted to me the importance, the necessity really, of examining wider systemic issues of accessibility, understanding and dismantling ableism through a social model of disability rather than a medical one. This includes acknowledging and mitigating, even eliminating, the implicit and explicit costs imposed on people with disabilities, and not only in monetary terms. These ponderings over the years eventually led me to Salvage Garden, an award-winning assistive tech makerspace. They operate as a pop-up in a library in One Punggol, an integrated lifestyle hub with an architecture that aptly seeks to reduce barriers and improve one's sense of well-being in the space through architectural gestures. Salvage Garden's founder, Saad, speaks excitedly about their myriad of projects and prototypes, including a braille printer, a one-handed nail clipper, and a tactile tic-tac-toe, all the most joyful manifestations of empathetic design thinking. An overarching principle here is open source. All digital files for their designs, rigorously worked on week after week by a team deeply involving people with disabilities, are available for all to download and 3D print in any of the 4 library-based makerspaces in Singapore. Equity, diversity, and inclusion is not always about the technicalities of rectification and retrofitting, nor about building new stuff in buildings to address challenges, but about imaginative rethinking from first principles, which includes questioning our preconceptions and assumptions about how things should be in the first place.
How can we re-envision spaces in the city, such that we can use these spaces not for profits, but let these spaces enable us to meet people's needs?
However, there is, of course, a time and place for fixing and repairing. In my everyday life, I do find myself repairing stuff, to varying degrees of success and invariably deploying the help of YouTube, crumpled and yellowed instruction manuals, and some very can-do friends. I do quite like the eclecticism and anachronism of having objects from different eras, each with a provenance, a story. It's truly life-affirming. Such is also the experience one would get from visiting Repair Kopitiam, a community repair meetup operating every last Sunday of the month in various neighbourhoods. I visited them with a worn rubber duck backpack, and heavily assisted by an experienced volunteer, Ducky was back up and quacking again. Sewing and other DIY skills are excellent for developing self-sufficiency and useful not only for mending but also for upcycling. My grandmother, for one, sews clothes and blankets out of unwanted fabrics such as old bed linen. Not to mention, such skills are great for if you need to fashion a cosplay or LARP costume at a lower cost, or if you would like to gift someone something handmade. My university ran a free shop where graduating students would donate their items to incoming students, as well as a swap shop where people could swap out unwanted clothes. As a lot of a cheapskate, I have my fair share of hand-me-downs and thrifted goods, particularly as charity shops are commonplace in the UK and free sharing apps can get pretty addictive. Here in Singapore, it's also always hilarious to see the kinds of second-hand items people list and their reasons, including this fellow who bought a giant duck toy to surprise his wife, only to find out that she was afraid of ducks. But beyond the humour are some provocative questions about our differential perceptions of value and how we can redistribute resources accordingly, which communities such as Freegan in Singapore are perhaps inadvertently exploring. And giving isn't just about material goods, we can also share skills and spaces, both physical spaces and the space we hold for others. While the idea that the best things in life are free can be overtly simplistic, I prefer to think of it as a way to acknowledge and embrace the value in things that aren't intensely and explicitly tethered to capital. There are several common threads coursing through and between these various communities, projects, and themes: collaboration, imaginative value systems, redistribution, kind and creative resistance, systemic agitation, and engagement. Yet we must remain mindful about how these concepts can rather easily be co-opted by those holding disproportionate amounts of power, and the mental gymnastics and 4D chess these people and groups are more than willing to perform to retain and expand their power, which can be insidious and frankly quite impressive. So with that, I'll round off with a question on how we invest our time and resources in a still largely profit-driven world. Are there forms of investing where no profit is sought, but instead profit is redistributed within the community for the betterment of the human and non-human?